For 2 weeks, one name has floated over this case with no story attached to it. Katie, the young woman Nolan Wells was last seen talking to on Horn Island. Tonight, her family has broken its silence. Her account is finally on the record, and it collides head-on with the story his friends told. According to Katie, through her family's public statement and her cooperation with investigators, Nolan told her he was heading back to rejoin his friends on their boat. According to those friends, Nolan said the opposite, that he was choosing to stay behind with her. Both of those sentences cannot be true. Someone's memory of an 18-year-old's final known plan is wrong, and his parents have to bury him without knowing whose. But here is what changed this week. For the first time, there is a witness in this case with no memory, no loyalty, and no version of events. A machine. GPS tracking data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, obtained by CBS News, now maps every movement of that boat on the 4th of July, down to the minute when it left, when it reached the island, the moment at 4:31 in the afternoon when it pulled away without Nolan Wells on board, and the 4 separate movements it made after that. A sequence ending with the boat out of the water entirely, on land at a residence in Biloxi before the night was over. That record does not care whose story is convenient. If you are following this case closely, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault. It pushes Nolan's story, told carefully and factually, ahead of the versions that are not. Your support matters in keeping cases like this in front of the people who need to see them. Tonight, we lay the GPS data against both accounts, minute by minute, along with a grand jury commitment, a phone inspection finally agreed to, and a 90-minute gap that nobody has explained. It starts with the name. For most of this case, Katie existed as a single syllable inside other people's stories. Nolan's friends mentioned her. The family's attorneys referenced her. The internet, being the internet, invented 100 versions of her. What almost nobody had was her actual account. And the reason her silence lasted this long makes more sense once you remember how her name entered this story in the first place. It entered on the worst night of Christine Wonsley's life. When the call came that Nolan had not returned from Horn Island, the explanation his mother received involved a girl Nolan had supposedly wanted to stay behind with, a girl nobody in the group could fully identify, and then stacked on top of a mother's panic came something worse. Word that this girl might be missing too. Picture that arithmetic. One child unaccounted for on a barrier island, and suddenly possibly 2. The second one with no last name, no number to call, no family to reach. That second fear at least dissolved. Katie was never missing. She had left Horn Island safely that same day on a different boat, by her family's account, picked up by her own parents, and she had been reachable the entire time. The person who finally put that on the record was not law enforcement, and not Nolan's friends. It was a member of Katie's own family, Katie McCormack, who posted publicly once speculation about the young woman began spreading in ways her family never asked for. And the McCormack family statement did more than correct a rumor. It laid out Katie's side of that afternoon. She was on Horn Island. She spent time with Nolan. The two parted ways. And here is the sentence that turned a footnote into the center of this case. By her family's account, Katie assumed that the friends who were telling Nolan to get on the boat would never actually leave without him. She said goodbye, believing he had a ride home. Her family says she has no knowledge of anything that happened to him afterward, that she has been in contact with Nolan's family, that she is cooperating with law enforcement, and that they have given, in their words, all the answers we can give. And notice the exact wording her family chose because it carries something easy to miss. By their phrasing, Katie assumed the friends who were telling Nolan to get on the boat would not leave without him, telling him to get on the boat. If that phrasing is accurate, and it is the family's own, offered publicly, then in Katie's memory of that goodbye, the friends were urging Nolan aboard, which sits uneasily beside the other account in this case, the one in which Nolan flatly told those same friends he was staying. That tension is observation, not accusation. A single sentence in a family's statement is not testimony, and no investigator has publicly weighed it. But it is on the record now, and a grand jury may one day read it. Now set her account beside the other one, because this is the collision the whole case turns on. Attorney Ben Crump, representing the Wells family, says Katie's version has been specific and has not wavered. Nolan told her he was planning to get back on his friend's boat before it left. The friend's version, as it has been described to investigators, is the mirror opposite. Nolan told them he wanted to stay on the island with her, by his own choice, in his own words. Hold both of those in your hands for a second. If Katie is right, then Nolan's plan was to leave, and something happened between his stated intention and the boat pulling away without him. Something nobody has explained. If the friends are right, then Nolan deliberately chose to stay alone on a remote barrier island as his only ride home departed, which opens an entirely different set of questions about the hours that followed. There is no third option. One of these two accounts of an 18-year-old's last known decision is wrong, and as of this recording, nobody with the authority to resolve it has done so. His parents live inside that unresolved space. Now, grief has a shape. It is the loss of a person. This is something crueler, layered on top, the loss of even knowing your son's final choice. And spare one honest minute for the other side of this collision, because there is a second family living inside this case who never volunteered for it. Katie McCormack is a young woman who went to an island on a holiday, talked with a young man, said goodbye and went home, and within days her first name was a national search term. Her family statement exists, remember, only because online speculation about her spread in ways they never expected and never invited. Since then, childhood friends have publicly come to the family's defense, pushing back against strangers passing judgment on people they have never met. Whatever the eventual answer in this case turns out to be, nothing in the public record accuses Katie of anything. By every account, including the Wells family's own legal team, she has done exactly one thing: told investigators what she remembers, consistently, from the beginning. That is why you will not hear her age, her school, or anything from her social media in this coverage. Her account matters to this case. Her life outside it is not ours to mine. What her account did, though, the moment it went on the record, was force a question that had been avoidable for 2 weeks. Because once her version existed in public, side by side with the friend's version, everyone could finally see that the two do not fit. And into exactly that standoff this week arrived the one participant in this story that does not give accounts at all: the machine record. Because this week, for the first time, part of that afternoon stopped being a matter of anyone's word. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources is the state agency that polices Mississippi's waterways, and it was part of this case from the first night, working the search alongside the United States Coast Guard and the National Park Service, whose rangers manage Horn Island itself. When Nolan was reported missing, the department opened its own report on the incident, and that report contains something no witness interview can offer: the tracked movements of the boat at the center of this case, hour by hour, on the 4th of July. This week, CBS News obtained it. What follows is not testimony. It is telemetry. 9:56 in the morning, the 4th of July, the boat leaves a private dock in Jackson County. 11:14, it arrives at Horn Island. From there, for several hours, the record simply shows what a holiday looks like. A boat at rest off a barrier island while a group of young people celebrates on the sand, the same as hundreds of others along that coast. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells by his family's legal team comes at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon near the island's northwest end. And then 4:31, the boat leaves Horn Island. Nolan Wells is not on it. Stop on that timestamp because it quietly rewrites the story the public had been told from the earliest days of this case. The accounts relayed through investigators and attorneys had the group leaving the island at around 3 o'clock, right on top of Nolan's last sighting. The tracker says otherwise. The boat did not pull away until 4:31, which means there are roughly 90 minutes sitting between the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nolan Wells and the moment his ride home actually left. 90 minutes, on that island, that no account from anyone has ever described. Where was Nolan during that hour and a half? Where were his friends? Where was the boat? The data cannot say. It can only prove the gap exists. And until this week, nobody knew it did. That gap is worth one more beat, because it teaches something bigger than this case. For 2 weeks, this story ran entirely on human accounts, and human accounts bend. Not always from lying, from loyalty, from fear, from memory doing what memory does under pressure. Then one machine record arrived, and within a day, it had exposed a 90-minute hole that every human version of that afternoon had quietly papered over. That is the difference between stories and records. And learning to weigh one against the other is the closest thing there is to an investigator's instinct. It is about listening to an account the way a detective does, what people emphasize, what they skip, which details stay fixed, and which ones drift. And when a story is shaped more by what someone needs to be true than by what happened. Now, back to the tracker, because the boat's day was not over. After 4:31, the record shows the boat returning to its original departure dock. An ordinary end to an ordinary trip if it had stopped there. It did not stop there. At 5:52 that evening, the boat is moving again, traveling into Fort Bayou. At 6:06, it is back at the dock. At 7:19, its position shifts one more time to the Fort Bayou boat launch. And from there, according to the Marine Resources report, the boat leaves the water entirely. It travels over land, presumably towed by a vehicle, in the report's own careful phrasing, to a residence in Biloxi, owned by the boat's owners. Notice that word, presumably. The tracker can see the boat move down a highway. It cannot see the trailer or the truck pulling it. So the report refuses to claim what its data cannot show. That is what disciplined evidence handling sounds like. And it is the standard every account in this case should be held to. Count that sequence. 4 separate recorded movements after the moment Nolan was left behind on that island. Not one trip home and a quiet driveway, a series of stops across the evening, ending with the boat hauled out of the water and parked at a private home in another city. All while across town, Christine Wonsley was beginning the longest night of her life. By 7:19 that evening, she still had hours to go before the call that told her Nolan had not come home, and while the boat sat on land in Biloxi, the rest of this timeline was beginning. Christine's call to authorities that night, the search launching at first light, Coast Guard, Marine Resources, park rangers, and volunteers sweeping the island and the water around it through the 5th of July. And then on the morning of the 6th, the discovery no search wants to make. Nolan's body in the water off the island, identified through dental records by the Jackson County coroner. The state autopsy followed on the 7th. Its results are still sealed. Lay that whole arc against the tracker's log, and you feel the dissonance this family has been describing for 2 weeks. By the time the boat was parked at a residence for the night, the boy it had carried to that island had not even been reported missing yet. Now, the honest limits of this evidence stated as plainly as the evidence itself. GPS proves where a boat went. It does not prove who was on board at any given point, what was said, or what happened on that island after the boat pulled away. Moving a boat, washing a boat, hauling a boat home, on their own, these are things boat owners do, and the track sequence is not by itself evidence of any crime. What the record does is narrow the world. It replaces 2 weeks of approximation with timestamps. And every account anyone gives from this point forward, to investigators, to a grand jury, to the public, will have to fit inside them. Be equally clear about what the gap does and does not license. 90 undescribed minutes is not evidence that something sinister filled them. Islands are big, groups scatter, teenagers lose track of time. What the gap does is convert a vague afternoon into a specific investigative demand. Every person who was on or near that stretch of Horn Island between 3 o'clock and 4:31 now holds a piece of this case, whether they realize it or not. That is precisely why the sheriff's office has kept its public request open for original unedited photos and videos from the island that day. Because somewhere in a stranger's camera roll, time-stamped by the same unforgiving clocks, may sit the frames that fill the hole the tracker just exposed. 2 more details from that report deserve the record. First, the Marine Resources document notes that the boat's owner, the owner's mother, and another person who was reportedly with Nolan that day all cooperated with its investigators. Second, the department's own report ends on the 5th of July, the day the Jackson County Sheriff's Office took control of the case. Which means whatever the trackers, the interviews, and the physical evidence have shown since then sits inside the sheriff's file, unreleased, waiting for the process you will hear about shortly. But first, the small things. Because while the machine data redrew the big picture this week, Nolan's parents have spent 2 weeks cataloging the small ones. None of them is a headline alone. Together, they are the family's answer to a question they keep being asked. Why can't you just accept the account you were given? What follows is that answer, item by item, each one attributed to the family that raised it. Because in a case built on other people's memories, the details that refuse to fit are not noise. They are the case. Start with a piece of clothing. By the family's account, the official report in this case described Nolan wearing black shorts. Then a young woman who had been on the island that day reached out to Christine directly with photographs from that afternoon. In those photos, by Christine's account, her son is wearing blue. Black and blue are not colors a camera confuses. On its own, it reads like a clerical slip. But a mother who can no longer ask her son anything does not have the luxury of on its own. For her, a wrong detail in an official document is not a footnote. It is a thread. And a case built almost entirely on other people's memories is exactly the kind of case where you keep pulling. Then the keys. Before Nolan's body was found, while his parents were still living inside the hope of a phone call, they went to a friend's house to retrieve his car, a task that should have taken 3 minutes. By the family's account, it did not. The friend at the door could not find the keys. He went back inside. Minutes passed. The kind that stretch when your child is missing, and every second feels like evidence of something you cannot name. When the friend returned, he had the keys, but the delay, small as it was, joined the list. Not because it proves anything, because it felt like everything else in this case. A simple moment that should have been simple, that was not. These are not the kinds of details that build a criminal case, but they are the kinds of details that explain why a mother cannot let go of the feeling that the story she has been given does not fit the son she raised. And in a situation where the official account and the family's instinct sit on opposite sides of a widening gap, these small frictions accumulate. They build pressure. They ask to be explained. Now pair those small inconsistencies with the larger structural problem this case cannot escape. Two people, both by all accounts credible, both cooperating with law enforcement, both with no apparent reason to fabricate, have given mutually exclusive versions of an 18-year-old's final known plan. Katie McCormack's family says Nolan told her he was going back to the boat. Nolan's friends say he told them he was staying on the island. One of those memories is incorrect. And until someone with investigative authority determines which, this case sits in a kind of suspended animation. The Wells family cannot grieve with clarity. The McCormack family cannot step out of a spotlight they never sought. The friends live under a cloud of unanswered questions, and the public watches a story that has all the pieces of resolution except the one that matters most. The truth about what an 18-year-old boy said he was going to do in the last hour anyone saw him alive. That brings us back to the 90 minutes. Because if the GPS data did nothing else, it converted that question from abstract to concrete. Before this week, the departure time was approximate. Around 3 o'clock, people said. Close enough to the last sighting that the two events felt like they belonged together. One moment Nolan is seen on the island. The next, more or less, the boat is gone. The gap between them narrow enough that it did not demand explanation. But 4:31 is not around 3 o'clock. It is an hour and a half later. And an hour and a half is long enough for dozens of interactions, decisions, and movements that no account has described. It is long enough for plans to change, for conversations to happen, for someone to be in one place and then another, for a group to regroup or split apart, for a goodbye to occur at the start of that window or the end of it. The difference matters. If Katie said goodbye to Nolan at 3 o'clock, believing he would get on a boat that did not leave until 4:31, then what was he doing in the 90 minutes after she left? And where were the friends during that same period? Were they on the boat, on the beach, somewhere else on the island? If the goodbye happened later, closer to 4:31, then what was everyone doing in the earlier part of that window? And why has no version of events acknowledged that this window existed at all? These are not gotcha questions. They are the basic investigative demands that a verified timeline creates. And the fact that they have not been answered publicly does not mean they have not been asked. It means the answers, if they exist, are sitting in files that have not been opened to the public. Or they mean that the people who were there do not have answers, because they were not tracking time, because nothing felt urgent in the moment, because it was a holiday and a boat trip and a sunny afternoon, and nobody had any reason to treat it like something that would need to be reconstructed minute by minute 2 weeks later. That is the more charitable read, and it may be the correct one. But it does not change what the family is living with, which is the knowledge that somewhere in that 90-minute window, their son's fate was decided, and the public record contains no description of it. The investigation may. The sheriff's file may hold witness statements that account for every minute of that window. The phone data that was finally agreed to may show location and communication patterns that fill the gap completely. But until that information becomes part of the public accounting, the family is left with what everyone else has. A timeline with a hole in it. A hole exactly wide enough to contain all the questions this case cannot answer. Now, the timeline after the boat left the island. Because while the 90-minute gap is about what we do not know, the post-departure sequence is about what we do. The GPS tracker does not speculate. It records. And what it recorded after 4:31 is a boat in motion. Not constant motion, but repeated motion. 4 separate trips or stops between the moment the boat left Horn Island and the moment it was hauled out of the water in Biloxi. The first movement, back to the original dock, fits the expected pattern. A group returns from a day trip. Ordinary, explainable. The kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in summer. But then the boat moves again. At 5:52, it is traveling into Fort Bayou. 14 minutes later, at 6:06, it is back at a dock. That is a short trip. Short enough that it suggests a specific purpose. Refueling perhaps, picking something up, dropping something off, running an errand that required water access. None of that is suspicious in isolation. Boaters make short trips for a dozen reasons. Then, at 7:19, the boat is on the move one more time, this time to the Fort Bayou boat launch. And from that point, the tracker shows it leaving the water entirely, traveling over land to a residence in Biloxi. Again, normal boat owner behavior. You take your boat out of the water, you clean it, you store it, you park it at home. The sequence, step by step, is unremarkable. What gives it weight is the context. Because while that sequence was unfolding, while the boat was making its second and third and fourth movements of the evening, Christine Wonsley did not yet know her son was missing. The timeline the tracker provides is not just a record of where the boat went. It is a record of when. And when you place that record next to the timeline of a mother's worst night, the dissonance is hard to ignore. At 5:52, when the boat moved into Fort Bayou, Christine still believed her son was on his way home. At 6:06, when it returned to the dock, she had not received the call. At 7:19, when it was hauled out of the water, Nolan Wells had not been reported missing. The ordinary post-trip routine of a boat and its owner was happening in one part of the county while, in another part, a family's life was about to collapse. That is not an accusation. It is a fact. And it is the kind of fact that makes a mother ask questions. Because if the people on that boat knew, or should have known, that Nolan Wells was not safely home, then the decision to make multiple stops, to take the boat out of the water, to park it at a residence for the night, all of that takes on a different character, not necessarily a criminal character, but a character that demands explanation. And so far, the public has not received one. The Marine Resources Report documents the movements. It does not editorialize about them. The sheriff's investigation, which has been active since the 5th of July, may have asked these questions and received satisfactory answers. But those answers are not in the public domain, and in the absence of an official explanation, the family is left to wonder, not because they are inventing suspicion, because the timeline creates it. Now, what the family has said publicly about their son, because in a case where so much of the story is being told by other people, it matters to hear from the people who knew Nolan Wells best. His mother, Christine Wonsley, has described him as responsible, the kind of young man who stayed in contact, who let his family know where he was, who did not make his parents worry. That description, offered by a grieving mother, could be dismissed as idealization, except that it is testable. If Nolan was the kind of person who regularly made plans and then abandoned them without notice, there would be a pattern. Friends, family, past trips, past holidays. Someone would have a story about the time Nolan decided to stay somewhere on a whim and did not tell anyone. But no such story has emerged. Which does not mean Nolan was incapable of spontaneity. It means that the version of events in which he casually decided to stay on a remote island as his only ride home left, without making any arrangement for how he would get back, without telling his family, without apparent concern for the consequences, that version does not match the pattern of behavior the people who knew him describe. Again, that is not proof. People act out of character. Teenagers make impulsive decisions. A holiday, a conversation, a moment of connection. Any of those could have shifted someone's usual pattern. But it is context. And in a case where two accounts conflict, context is part of how you evaluate which account is more likely to be accurate. Katie's family has provided context too. They have described a young woman who went to an island, spent time with someone she met there, and left safely. They have emphasized her cooperation with law enforcement. They have pushed back against speculation that has tried to turn her into something other than what she is. A witness. That is all the public record supports. She was there. She talked to Nolan. She left. She has told investigators what she remembers. And her memory is that Nolan intended to leave the island with his friends. That is her account, and it has been consistent. The friends have given a different account, and by all indications, it has also been consistent. Which means this is not a case of someone changing their story. It is a case of two stories that cannot both be right. And that returns us to the question at the center of everything. What happened in the final minutes before that boat left at 4:31? Was there a conversation that Katie was not part of, in which Nolan changed his mind? Was there a miscommunication, where Nolan thought he was telling his friends one thing and they heard another? Was there an argument, a moment of frustration, a decision made in anger or haste that no one wants to describe? Or is one account simply wrong? Not maliciously wrong. Just wrong in the way memory can be wrong when it is reconstructed under unimaginable pressure. When you are being asked to remember the last thing someone said before they died. When you know that your answer will be weighed by investigators, by attorneys, by a grieving family, by the public. That kind of pressure does not make people lie, but it can make them certain of things they are not certain of. It can turn a probably into a definitely. It can smooth over gaps and contradictions, because the mind wants a story that makes sense. And here is the hardest part. Even if investigators determine which account is more accurate, even if phone data or witness statements or some piece of evidence clarifies what Nolan's actual plan was, it will not change what happened. He is gone. The answer to the question of what he intended to do will not bring him back. But it will give his family something they do not have right now, the ability to grieve with knowledge instead of uncertainty. Because uncertainty is its own kind of torture. It keeps the mind in a loop. If he meant to come home, then why didn't he? If he meant to stay, then what was his plan? Every scenario leads to another question. Every question leads back to the gap. And the gap, the 90 minutes no one has described, sits at the center of it all, holding every answer the family does not have. This is where the case sits as the first part of this story closes. A young man is dead. 2 accounts of his final decision conflict. A machine record has exposed a gap in the timeline that no human account acknowledged. A family is searching for answers. A second family is caught in a situation they never asked for. And investigators are working a case that the public is watching with increasing intensity. The autopsy results remain sealed. The sheriff's investigation file remains closed. The grand jury process, mentioned by those close to the case, has not produced public action. And the questions that matter most, what happened in those 90 minutes, why the accounts conflict, and what the evidence will ultimately show, remain unanswered. For now, all we have is what the record provides: a timeline, a contradiction, and a family refusing to stop asking why the story they were given does not fit the son they knew. If this coverage matters to you, if you believe cases like Nolan Wells deserve careful factual examination, then subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault and share this video. The algorithm rewards engagement, and engagement keeps stories like this visible. It keeps pressure on the questions that need answers. And it reminds everyone involved that the public is paying attention. You are standing on someone else's porch waiting for your missing son's car keys while the clock runs and nobody can find them. The keys eventually surfaced exactly where the family says someone overheard on a phone call had mentioned they were the whole time, sitting on top of an Xbox inside the house. Maybe that is nothing. Teenagers lose keys. But for a family starving for one straight answer, friction at the precise moment things should have been simple stopped reading like coincidence. And then the phone, the object this entire case keeps returning to. Nolan posted to Snapchat nearly every day. His digital life, by every account, was an open book. In the roughly 24 hours before his family recovered his phone, that book went blank. No posts. Nothing. A silence everyone who knew him agrees was not him. The family found the device the evening of the 4th of July, using a locator app. And where they found it says as much as the silence does. At the home of one of his friends on the mainland. While Nolan himself was still on an island 10 miles out to sea, his phone had crossed the water without him. And by the family's account, when they opened it, messages were gone. None of these details alone tells anyone what happened to Nolan Wells. His parents know that better than the internet does. But laid side by side, a wrong color in a report, keys that took too long, a phone that traveled home without its owner and arrived empty, they are the reason this family says it cannot accept the official account as complete. Not because they have a theory, because they have questions no one has answered. One pause before the courthouse. Tomorrow morning, a mother buries her son while strangers online debate him like a puzzle. You cannot fix that. You can do one small thing against it. Put his name in the comments. Nolan Wells, written with respect. Let the record under this video be about a person, not a theory. Now, the meeting that finally moved this case. On the 15th of July in Pascagoula, Christine and Elmore Wonsley walked into the office of Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath. Their first face-to-face meeting with the prosecutor whose office will ultimately decide what this case becomes. Attorney Ben Crump described the meeting afterward as respectful and candid, and it produced the single biggest procedural development since the search itself. The district attorney committed to presenting this case to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation is complete. Now, precision, because that phrase carries more emotional weight than legal weight, and this family has had enough distortion. A grand jury referral is not a verdict. It is not a charge, it is not an announcement that investigators believe a crime occurred, and the district attorney's office itself made a point of saying that in Jackson County, presenting an unnatural or unexplained death to a grand jury is standard procedure, not an accusation. If you want coverage that separates procedure from speculation, that explains what legal developments actually mean, instead of what they feel like. Subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault right now. Turn on notifications. The next confirmed development in this case will be broken down here the moment it is verified, not the moment it trends. Here is what a grand jury commitment actually means. Per Mississippi law professor Ronald Reichlach, who has explained the mechanics in national coverage, a panel of roughly 15 to 25 citizens will hear the prosecutor's evidence, the interviews, the forensics, the timelines, presumably including the track record you heard in Part 1. And those citizens, not the sheriff and not the internet, will decide whether the evidence warrants charging anyone with anything. Two more mechanics worth knowing because they will shape how the next phase feels from the outside. Grand jury proceedings are secret. Witnesses appear without the public, without cameras, and without defense attorneys cross-examining them. That secrecy is by design, protecting both the investigation and the reputations of people who may never be charged, and the panel's threshold is probable cause, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. A decision about whether charges are warranted, not a determination of guilt. Which means that when this case disappears into that room, the silence that follows will not mean nothing is happening. It will mean the system is working the only way it is built to. It is a mechanism, movement, not resolution. But for a family that has spent 2 weeks feeling locked outside its own case, movement matters. Crump's stated hope was blunt, that every relevant witness and every piece of evidence reaches that jury room with nothing left out. The meeting produced a second agreement, and this one is genuinely unusual. Nolan's phone, the empty phone, will be examined jointly. Forensic experts retained by the family working alongside experts connected to the official investigation, running the extraction together, seeing the results at the same moment instead of trading competing press releases afterward. Attorney Eric Hertz is leading the family's technical team, staffed with former law enforcement specialists brought in for exactly this work. Understand what that arrangement actually cures because it is elegant. This phone has a trust problem in both directions. The family retrieved it themselves from a friend's home and has held it through its own expert review. So any result produced by the family's team alone would be attacked as unverifiable. Any result produced by the state alone would be distrusted by a family that has spent 2 weeks feeling shut out. A joint extraction, both sets of experts watching the same screen at the same moment, leaves neither side aversion to dispute. Whatever is in that phone, or provably was, arrives with no competing story attached. How unusual is that arrangement? Professor Reichlach put it simply. Evidence is secured and not usually shared. Prosecutors almost never open their forensic process to a victim's private team. That the district attorney agreed tells you something about the pressure on this case and about how central that phone has become to public trust in whatever answer eventually comes. Hertz also framed the family team's whole posture in terms worth hearing because they cut in every direction at once, including at this case's own online following. There are a lot of narratives circulating right now, he said, and he declined to endorse any of them, noting that when a case grows this large, people with all kinds of motivations start feeding versions of events designed to be followed. The job, in his words, is to cut through all the noise and find the truth through unbiased investigation, and he pointedly included unbiased lawyers and journalists in that demand. Coming from the family's own attorney, that is not a throwaway line. It is a warning to every corner of this story, this channel included. The family wants the truth, not a preferred narrative wearing its clothes. Hertz also put a grievance on the record that deserves reporting. Under Mississippi law, he said, a victim's family is entitled to the incident report in their case within 72 hours. As of that press conference, 11 days after Nolan disappeared, the family said it still had not received one. And Crump added a number that explains why this case keeps growing instead of fading. By his account, the legal team is receiving 50 to 100 calls a day from people who were on Horn Island that holiday, or who know people who were. Think about what that volume means in practice. 100 calls a day is not 100 breakthroughs. Most will be rumor, repetition, or well-meaning noise. But triage properly, with anything substantive routed to investigators, that flood is exactly how gaps like the one in this timeline historically get filled. Not by a dramatic confession, but by one caller who did not realize the ordinary thing they saw at 4 o'clock on a holiday afternoon was evidence. Somewhere in that volume of voices, the family believes, is the person who fills the 90-minute gap. Before the close tonight, the corrections desk, because 2 pieces of this case spread everywhere, both shaped what millions believed, and both have now been formally run down. If this channel asks you to trust its reporting, it owes you the corrections with the same volume as the claims. The first was a photograph. After Nolan's body was found, an image of him at a pool party began circulating with a devastating implication attached. That it had been taken after the 4th of July. That somewhere in the timeline, Nolan had still been alive. For a short, Disorienting stretch. Strangers shared that photo, genuinely hoping it meant this story was not what it was. And his family had to watch that hope spread, while knowing it was false. Rolling Stone settled it with the one thing that does not misremember: metadata. The photograph was taken on the 27th of June, a full week before Horn Island, and simply uploaded on the 5th of July, which is what created the confusion. There is a wrinkle inside this correction, that fairness requires airing. Attorney Crump himself had reposted that image while the claim was live, and when pressed, he did not walk it back quietly. His explanation, on the record. The team reposts circulating material to draw calls and comments from potential witnesses. And in his words, just because we repost does not mean we authenticate anything. You can judge that strategy however you like. A legal team drowning in tips chose reach over curation, and one cost of that choice was a grieving public briefly believing a false timeline. Both things are true, and both belong in the record. The second was a video. The argument clip that half the internet treated as the missing piece of this case, with a voice many believed was Nolan's protesting in his final hours. Traston Shepard, Nolan's longtime friend, ended that one himself. The voice on that recording, he confirmed, is his own, not Nolan's. A separate argument, a separate story, wrongly welded onto this one by a million shares. Understand why this channel spends whole minutes on corrections in a case like this one. It is not housekeeping. Everything said about Nolan Wells is being absorbed by two parents who will carry it for the rest of their lives. Every false timeline they had to publicly dismantle. Every misidentified voice they had to hear described as their son's final moments. Strangers get to scroll past a debunked rumor. His mother and father have to live downstream of every single one. Strip both corrections away and notice what is left standing underneath. No debunking touched the timeline. No metadata explained the contradiction between Katie's account and the friends. The corrections cleared away the noise, and the case underneath the noise got harder, not softer. There is one more piece of misinformation worth 30 seconds, because it inflated expectations about this investigation. The claim that the FBI had taken over. It has not. By the Bureau's own statement, the FBI's Jackson office has assisted Jackson County investigators on specific elements of the case centered on threats made against people connected to it. Threats that crossed state lines and therefore became federal business. Support, not command. And the nature of that support says something grim about what this case has become online. The federal government's involvement here is not about how Nolan died. It is about threats serious enough against people connected to this investigation to cross state lines and trigger federal jurisdiction. The same digital storm that surfaced witnesses and kept this case alive has also generated conduct the FBI now has to run down. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has been the lead agency since the first search boat left the dock, and it still is. Which means the pace of this case, for better or worse, belongs to Jackson County. So here is exactly where everything stands tonight. 15 days in. There is still no cause of death. The state's autopsy, performed on the 7th of July, remains sealed behind toxicology testing that officials say must finish before any cause or manner is ruled. The independent autopsy, the one Nolan's family flew him to Washington for, funded through Colin Kaepernick's organization, has been delayed by complications in transporting him, and its results have not been released either. The family's team says only that it hopes to share them soon. The sheriff's position has not changed. His investigators have found no evidence of foul play, and the case is not classified as criminal. Note the word classified, because it is doing careful work. A classification is a status, not a verdict. It can change the day toxicology lands, the day the phone speaks, or the day a grand jury decides it should. Nothing about the current label closes this case, and the district attorney's grand jury commitment is proof the system itself is not treating it as closed. The family's position has not changed either. Too many details refuse to sit still. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been named a suspect. The grand jury waits on the sheriff. The phone inspection agreed to in that Pascagoula meeting has not yet taken place. And the contradiction at the center of it all, Katie's account against the friends, remains exactly where it was, unresolved by anyone with the authority to resolve it. One more piece of tonight's record, and it belongs to Christine Wonsley in her own right. As the funeral approached this week, she posted a message that traveled far beyond Mississippi, writing that this loss, this grief, this pain is different. 4 words doing the work of 1,000. Different, not just because her son is gone at 18, but because she has to mourn him inside an unfinished question. In public, on a schedule set by laboratories and jury calendars she does not control. The town has responded in kind. When the funeral outgrew its first plans, The Mississippi Coast Convention Center formally offered to host it, its commission backing the idea unanimously before the family ultimately chose to bring Nolan home to a church in Ocean Springs instead. A community offering its biggest room and a family choosing its most familiar one. Which brings this back to the question the whole update hangs on. Two people heard Nolan Wells describe his last plan, and they heard opposite things. This week, for the first time, a machine drew hard lines around where the truth of that afternoon has to live, after his last sighting at around 3 o'clock, before a departure at 4:31. Inside 90 minutes no account has ever described. Every witness call coming into the legal team, every extraction pulled from that phone, every fact the district attorney eventually carries into a grand jury room, all of it now gets measured against those timestamps. Stories bend, the record does not, and somewhere between 3 o'clock and 4:31 on the 4th of July, the story and the record are going to meet. So mark what actually comes next, because this case now has a visible road. The funeral tomorrow. The independent autopsy results which the family's team says it hopes to release soon. The single development most likely to reshape everything. The joint phone inspection agreed to but not yet scheduled, with its answer to the deleted messages question waiting inside. The sheriff's investigation running to completion on its own clock. And then, at the end of that road, a room in Jackson County where 15 to 25 ordinary citizens will hear all of it. The accounts, the timestamps, the extraction, and decide what this case is. Every one of those steps will be covered here the day it is confirmed. And underneath every timestamp and legal term tonight, there is still a town holding its breath. Ocean Springs is the community that celebrated Nolan's signing day, that watched him carry its colors on Friday nights, whose teenagers organized their own marches for him and were asked by his mother, gently, to keep them peaceful because that is who her son was. Tomorrow that same town fills a church for him. The distance between those two gatherings, a signing day and a funeral, separated by a few years and one afternoon on an island, is the true size of what this family is carrying. While the rest of the country debates the details, when the autopsies unseal, when the phone gives up what it holds, when the grand jury acts, this channel will break it down the moment it is confirmed and not 1 minute before. No leaked speculation dressed as news, no theory presented as a scoop. Because two parents in Ocean Springs will hear every word said about their son, and they have absorbed enough noise from this case already. Tomorrow morning at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs, the town that watched Nolan Wells grow up will file past him one last time. Reverend Al Sharpton will deliver the eulogy. Tyler Perry paid for the service so his family would not have to. And in the afternoon at the Jackson County Fairgrounds there will be, by his mother's own insistence, something like a party. Because Christine Wonsley knows her son, even now, better than this case ever will. "We want to celebrate Nolan," she said. He would not want anyone sitting around crying. 18 years old, a teammate, a big brother to a whole community, a young man whose mother filled her phone with his smile. Tomorrow he is laid to rest. The questions are not, Nolan Xavier Wells. Say his name and stay with this story until it is answered. Now, what the joint phone examination actually means for the investigative timeline and why it matters more than any other piece of evidence waiting, because while the public has focused on the GPS data and the conflicting accounts, investigators have been focused on something else. The digital footprint of an 18-year-old who lived his life online until the moment that life went silent. Nolan's Snapchat account was active almost daily. Friends describe him as someone who documented everything. The ordinary moments, the celebrations, the daily check-ins that teenagers use to stay connected. That pattern held steady right up until the 4th of July, and then it stopped. Not gradually, not with decreasing frequency. It stopped entirely in the hours before his family used a tracking app to locate the device. That silence is its own kind of evidence. Not proof of what happened, but proof that something changed. Because behavioral patterns, especially digital ones, do not break without reason. And when the reason remains unexplained, the pattern itself becomes a question investigators have to answer. The family's account of finding the phone adds layers to that question. Using a locator app, standard technology most smartphones have built in, they trace the device to a friend's home on the mainland. Not on Horn Island where Nolan was last seen. Not in the water where his body was eventually found. At a residence, across 10 miles of open water, in a location Nolan himself never reached. That creates a logistics problem the investigation has to solve. How does a phone travel from a barrier island to the mainland without its owner? The obvious answer is that someone brought it, Either Nolan gave it to someone before they left, or someone took it with them when the boat departed at 4:31. Both scenarios are possible. Both raise immediate follow-up questions. If Nolan gave someone his phone before the boat left, why? Was it dying and needed charging? Was there a specific reason he would not need it on the island? Did he expect to get it back later, implying he had a plan for leaving the island that no one has described? If someone took the phone without Nolan explicitly handing it over, when did that happen? Was it collected with other belongings when the group was packing to leave? Was it found somewhere on the boat after departure? The family's claim that messages were gone when they opened the device adds another dimension. Modern phones do not spontaneously delete messages. Someone has to actively remove them, or the device has to be reset, or specific apps have to be uninstalled and reinstalled. Any of those actions would leave traces in the phone's system logs, which is exactly what a forensic extraction is designed to recover. This is where the joint examination becomes critical, because the presence or absence of deleted messages is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of forensic fact. Either the messages were removed, or they were not. If they were removed, the extraction will show when, how, and potentially by whom, if the deletion coincided with other device activity that can be traced. If the messages are still there, recoverable in the phone's deeper data structures, then the question becomes why the family believed they were gone. Was it a matter of not knowing where to look? Were messages archived rather than deleted? Was there confusion between different messaging platforms? All of that is resolvable through technical examination. What makes the joint inspection unusual, and what makes it valuable to public trust, is that both sides will see the same results at the same time. The family's experts cannot claim the state is hiding something. The state cannot claim the family is manipulating evidence. Whatever the phone reveals enters the record as a single, undisputed set of facts. Attorney Eric Hertz, leading the family's forensic team, brings a background that matters here. Former law enforcement specialists understand how digital evidence is collected, preserved, and presented in court. They know what questions to ask. They know what normal phone behavior looks like versus behavior that suggests tampering. And they know how to document their findings in ways that will hold up under legal scrutiny. That expertise cuts both ways. If the phone examination reveals nothing suspicious, if messages are intact, and the activity log shows normal usage patterns up until the device went silent, the family's team will say so. That is the commitment Hertz made publicly. Unbiased investigation. Truth over narrative. The same standard he demanded from journalists and lawyers covering the case applies to his own team's work. But if the examination reveals deletions, if it shows the device was accessed after Nolan's last known contact, if the metadata tells a story that contradicts the accounts given to investigators, that will be documented too, and documented jointly, which means no dispute about methodology, no competing interpretations, no reason for anyone to dismiss the findings as partisan. The timing of when this examination happens matters almost as much as what it reveals. As of the Pascagoula meeting on July 15th, the inspection had been agreed to but not scheduled. That delay is not necessarily suspicious. Coordinating experts, securing the proper equipment, ensuring chain of custody protocols are followed, all of that takes time. But every day the examination is delayed is another day the public does not have answers. And in a case where public pressure is one of the few forces keeping momentum behind the investigation, delay creates risk. Not the risk that evidence will be lost, the phone is secured, but the risk that attention will drift, that the calls coming in at 50 to 100 per day will slow to a trickle, that witnesses who might have come forward will decide the moment has passed. That is why the family's legal team keeps emphasizing urgency, not just for their own closure, though that is real and valid, but because investigative windows close. Memories fade. People move. The teenager who saw something ordinary at 4:15 on Horn Island and did not think twice about it might not remember it clearly a month from now. The boater who passed near the island that afternoon and could place other vessels in the area might not have their receipts or logs accessible 6 weeks later. Time is evidence, and in a case built substantially on reconstructing a timeline, every delay is a small erosion of the foundation. This is not to suggest the sheriff's office is dragging its feet. Investigations take as long as they take. Toxicology cannot be rushed. Witnesses have to be interviewed carefully, not quickly. Physical evidence has to be processed according to protocols that exist for good reason. But it is to say that the family's frustration with pace is not irrational. They are not asking for conclusions before the work is done. They are asking for the work to be done with the same urgency they feel, And when procedural commitments like the phone examination get agreed to in mid-July, but still have not happened as the case stretches into its third week, that gap between agreement and action feeds the distrust the family is trying to overcome. Now, the legal framework that will ultimately determine what this case becomes. Because the grand jury commitment, while significant, is only one part of a larger structure. And understanding that structure explains why some questions will be answered publicly and others will not. Why some timelines are visible and others are not. Why a family can be told their son's death is under investigation while simultaneously being told it is not classified as criminal. Start with classification because it is doing more work than it appears to. When the sheriff's office says the case is not classified as criminal, that is a statement about current evidence, not final conclusion. It means that as of now, investigators have not found proof that a crime occurred. It does not mean they have found proof that a crime did not occur. Those are different statements. A classification can change the instant new evidence emerges. If toxicology reveals something inconsistent with accidental drowning, the classification changes. If the phone extraction shows evidence of foul play, the classification changes. If a witness comes forward with information that contradicts the established timeline in ways that suggest criminal conduct, the classification changes. The label is not a locked door. It is a current status, subject to revision as facts develop. The grand jury process operates on a different standard entirely. It does not require a criminal classification. It does not require the sheriff to believe a crime occurred. It requires only that a death is unexplained or unnatural, and the district attorney believes a jury of citizens should hear the evidence and make their own determination. In Mississippi, that is standard practice for deaths that do not have clear, immediate explanations. Which means the grand jury commitment is both significant and routine. Significant because it guarantees the evidence will be formally reviewed by people with subpoena power and the authority to charge. Routine because it is what happens in cases like this, regardless of whether investigators suspect foul play. Both things are true, and both need to be in the public understanding. Professor Reichlach's explanation of the probable cause standard is worth sitting with because it defines what the grand jury is actually being asked to do. Not determine guilt. Not even determine that a crime definitely happened. Only determine whether there is probable cause to believe a crime may have happened and that a specific person or persons should be charged. That is a lower bar than conviction, which requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. But it is not an insignificant bar. Probable cause means more than suspicion. It means evidence. It means facts that, if believed, would lead a reasonable person to conclude that criminal activity likely occurred. A hunch does not meet that standard. A theory does not meet it. Conflicting accounts, on their own, do not meet it. What does meet it is evidence that cannot be explained by lawful activity. Forensic findings inconsistent with accident. Testimony that directly contradicts established fact in ways that suggest intentional deception. Physical evidence that places someone in a location they denied being. Digital records that show actions inconsistent with the story given to investigators. That is the kind of material a grand jury weighs. And here is the challenge this case presents. Almost everything in the public record so far is ambiguous. A phone that traveled without its owner could be evidence of something sinister or evidence of ordinary phone sharing among teenagers. Messages that appear to be gone could be evidence of deletion or evidence of user error. A 90-minute gap in accounts could be evidence of coordination to hide something or evidence of people not paying attention to time on a holiday. The GPS data is the closest thing to unambiguous evidence, and even that proves only where a boat went, not what happened on it or around it. The conflicting accounts between Katie and the friends prove only that someone's memory is incorrect, not that anyone is lying or that a crime occurred. The details the family has cataloged, the short's color, the key's delay, prove only that the official record has been imperfect, not that it has been falsified. None of that is nothing, all of it matters. But converting it from questions into charges requires something more. It requires evidence that crosses the line from concerning to criminal. And whether that evidence exists is what the phone examination, the toxicology results, and the continued investigation will determine. This is why the family's legal team has been careful, more careful than the online discourse around this case, to separate what they know from what they suspect. They know Nolan is dead. They know his final plan, as described by two different sources, does not match. They know his phone ended up somewhere he did not. They know the timeline has gaps no account has filled. What they do not know, and what they have not claimed to know, is how those facts connect into a criminal narrative. Hertz's statement about cutting through noise and finding truth through unbiased investigation is not just rhetoric. It is a legal strategy. Because if this case eventually does go before a grand jury, and if that grand jury does return an indictment, the charges will have to survive scrutiny far more intense than anything the public can apply. Defense attorneys will challenge every piece of evidence. Judges will rule on admissibility. Jurors will demand proof, not speculation. Building a case that can survive that scrutiny requires discipline. It requires resisting the pressure to turn every unanswered question into an accusation. It requires acknowledging what the evidence shows and what it does not. And it requires trusting that if the truth is findable, the process will find it. That trust is hard for a grieving family, but it is what Hertz is asking them to maintain, and it is what the district attorney's grand jury commitment is designed to facilitate. Now, the corrections, because they teach something about how information moves in cases like this. The pool party photograph that circulated with the claim it was taken after July 4th spread because people wanted it to be true. Not maliciously, not to deceive, but because the alternative, that Nolan was gone, was too painful. And in that gap between what people hoped and what metadata proved, a false timeline took root. Rolling Stone's debunking, using the photograph's embedded metadata showing it was taken June 27th and uploaded July 5th, is an example of how digital evidence resolves ambiguity. Metadata does not care about narrative, it records what happened, and when human claims conflict with machine records, the machine wins. That is the same principle that made the GPS data so valuable. It is the same principle that will make the phone extraction decisive. The argument video, misidentified as Nolan's voice, spread for different reasons. It fit a narrative people had constructed about what must have happened. A confrontation, a heated moment, a decision made in anger. When Trask and Shepard confirmed the voice was his, not Nolan's, that narrative collapsed. But not before it had been shared thousands of times, absorbed into the case's mythology, and become part of what people believe they know. Both corrections matter, because they demonstrate how easily false information embeds itself in public understanding. And both corrections left the actual case harder, not easier, to explain away. No false photograph changed the GPS timeline. No misidentified voice altered the contradiction between accounts. The real evidence, the verified facts, are more troubling than the rumors, which is why this coverage keeps returning to them. Attorney Crump's explanation for reposting unverified material, that the team does it to generate witness calls and does not claim to authenticate everything, is worth examining critically, because it reveals a tension at the heart of high-profile legal advocacy. The need to keep a case visible competes with the need to keep information accurate. Reach competes with responsibility. Crump's strategy prioritizes reach. Repost widely, let the audience sort truth from fiction, and harvest the witness calls that emerge from the volume. That strategy works, evidenced by the 50 to 100 calls per day the team is receiving, but it has costs. One cost is that the family had to watch false hope spread and then publicly correct it. Another cost is that it trains the audience to distrust what the legal team shares because some of it has been unreliable. That tension is not unique to this case. Every advocacy campaign faces it. But in a case where one of the family's core complaints is that they cannot trust the official account because it has contained errors, there is irony in the family's own team amplifying unverified claims. Both things can be true. The official investigation can have made mistakes, and the family's legal team can have contributed to misinformation. Acknowledging both is not betrayal. It is accuracy. The FBI clarification matters because it corrects a dangerous assumption. When people heard the FBI was involved, many assumed it meant the case had been elevated, that federal resources were pouring in, that answers were imminent. The reality is narrower. The FBI's Jackson office is assisting with one specific element: threats against people connected to the investigation that crossed state lines. That involvement says something disturbing about what this case has unleashed. Someone, or multiple someones, made threats serious enough to trigger federal jurisdiction. Threats that cross state lines mean threats delivered electronically or by phone to people in different states. That is not casual online anger. That is conduct the FBI investigates because it meets the legal definition of interstate threats. Which means the digital attention that has kept this case alive has also generated criminal behavior. Strangers so convinced they know what happened, so certain of who is responsible, that they have threatened people who have not been charged with anything. That is the cost of virality in cases like this. The same energy that surfaces witnesses also targets innocents. And here is the hard part. The people being threatened may be witnesses whose cooperation the investigation needs. If someone who was on that boat, someone who has information about the 90-minute gap, is receiving threats, how likely are they to come forward? How likely are they to speak freely to investigators if they believe doing so will make them a target? Threats do not advance justice, they obstruct it. The sheriff's office remaining the lead agency means the pace of this investigation is set locally, not federally. Jackson County resources, Jackson County timelines, Jackson County decisions. That is not a criticism. Local agencies investigate deaths every day. But it does mean the case is not getting the FBI's full apparatus. It is getting assist on one element while the rest proceeds at the pace local capacity allows. For a family that feels urgency, that distinction matters. Federal involvement sounds like acceleration. The reality is that one narrow piece has federal support while everything else continues as it was. Managing that expectation gap is part of why Hertz and Crump have had to clarify what the FBI's role actually is. Now, the state of evidence as the case enters its third week. No cause of death. That is the single most important piece of information still outstanding, and it is outstanding because toxicology takes time. This is not foot dragging. This is chemistry. Testing biological samples for substances, waiting for cultures to grow, running screens that can take weeks to complete. Every toxicology lab in the country operates on similar timelines. Rushing the process means risking false results, which helps no one. The family's independent autopsy, funded through Colin Kaepernick's organization and performed in Washington, was supposed to provide a second opinion. But complications in transporting Nolan's body delayed the procedure, and the results have not been released. The family's team says it hopes to share them soon, but hope is not a timeline. Soon could mean days. It could mean weeks. That delay creates its own frustration, because the independent autopsy was supposed to be the family's answer to the question of whether they could trust the state's findings. If both autopsies reach the same conclusion, that adds weight. If they diverge, that adds questions. But neither scenario can unfold until the independent results are actually released. And here is the challenge. The longer the delay, the more the independent autopsy looks like it is being strategically held. That may not be fair. The delay may be entirely logistical, but perception matters in cases like this. If the family's team is waiting to release results until they have a full picture that includes toxicology and phone data, that is understandable strategy. But it also means the public is left waiting on multiple fronts simultaneously, with no clarity about which will resolve first. The sheriff's position that there is no evidence of foul play is the finding that has generated the most friction. The family hears that and asks how a healthy 18-year-old ends up dead in the water off an island without foul play being involved. The sheriff's office hears that and responds that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that just because they have not found proof of a crime does not mean they have stopped looking. Both positions are defensible. An unexplained death is not automatically a crime. People drown. Accidents happen. Tragic outcomes occur without criminal agency, but an unexplained death with this many unanswered questions, with conflicting accounts and a 90-minute gap and a phone that traveled separately from its owner, is not a death that closes easily either. The classification as non-criminal is, as stated earlier, subject to change. What has not changed is that the investigation remains active. Witnesses continue to be interviewed. Evidence continues to be processed. The grand jury commitment ensures that even if the sheriff's office never changes its classification, the evidence will still be reviewed by citizens with the power to reach a different conclusion. That is the safety valve the system provides. If local investigators miss something, if their conclusion is wrong, if the evidence supports charges they did not pursue, the grand jury can act. That does not happen often. Grand juries generally follow law enforcement recommendations. But the mechanism exists precisely for cases where the official conclusion and the public evidence do not align. Now, what happens at a funeral for someone the whole country is watching? Because tomorrow, Ocean Springs will do what small towns do. It will gather, it will grieve, it will remember one of its own, but it will do so under a spotlight that most funerals never endure. Reverend Al Sharpton delivering the eulogy means national media. Tyler Perry paying for the service means celebrity attention. And a mother asking for a celebration instead of a somber service means a community trying to honor both the life lost and the questions that remain. Christine Wonsley's insistence on celebration is not denial, it is defiance. Defiance of the narrative that wants to turn her son into a mystery before he is remembered as a person. Defiance of the grief that wants to consume everything. Defiance of the idea that because the questions are unanswered, the life is somehow less worth celebrating. She knows her son better than this case does, and she is determined that the town that raised him will remember who he was, not just how he died. The afternoon gathering at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, described as something like a party, is an extension of that same determination. Nolan would not want anyone sitting around crying. That is a mother speaking. Not about the investigation, not about the evidence, about her son, about who he was when he was not a headline, when he was just a young man who made people laugh, who played football, who had plans. That is the person being buried tomorrow. Not the case, not the contradictions, not the timeline with gaps. A person. Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old. A full name that deserves to be said in full because it belongs to someone who existed before this case and whose memory will exist after it resolves. The distance between a signing day and a funeral, both held for the same person within the span of a few years, is the measurement of a future that will not happen. Every parent at that funeral will feel it, every teammate, every teacher. The weight of all the things Nolan will not get to do, the college he will not attend, the career he will not build, the family he will not raise. All of it ended on an afternoon on an island, in circumstances that remain unexplained. That is what the family is carrying. Not just grief, though that alone would be unbearable, but grief compounded by uncertainty, by questions, by the feeling that the story they have been given does not account for the son they knew, by the wait for toxicology, for phone data, for witness statements, for grand jury decisions, for anything that might make it make sense. And nothing will make it make sense. That is the cruelest part. Even if every question is answered, even if the timeline is filled, even if the contradictions resolve, Nolan will still be gone. The answers the family is fighting for will not bring him back, but they will give the family something to hold that is not just absence. They will give them knowledge, and knowledge, even painful knowledge, is something you can grieve with. Uncertainty is something you drown in. So when the case updates arrive, when the phone examination happens, when toxicology returns, when the grand jury convenes, when the next development breaks, it will be covered here with the same commitment. Verified facts, clear explanations, no speculation dressed as news. No theories presented as scoops. Because two parents in Ocean Springs will hear every word, and they deserve better than noise. If that standard matters to you, if you want coverage that waits for confirmation instead of chasing clicks, subscribe to Mr. Story's Crime Vault. Turn on notifications. The next verified development will be broken down here the moment it is confirmed, not the moment it is rumored. Not the moment it trends, the moment it is true. Tomorrow, Ocean Springs says goodbye. The case does not. The investigation continues. The grand jury waits. The phone holds its secrets until experts extract them, and somewhere in the gap between 3 o'clock and 4:31 on the 4th of July, the truth of what happened to Nolan Xavier Wells is waiting to be found. This channel will be here when it is. Until then, say his name, remember his life, and let his family grieve with the dignity every family deserves.